Cabin Pressurization Control System. The following object: 3 cabin altitude control modes are available. 2 of these modes provide full automatic operation. The modes are automatic, alternate, manual. In the auto or alternate mode, the pressurization control panel is used to preset the flight cruise altitude and landing altitude into the pressure controller. The air-ground safety sensor signals whether the airplane is on the ground or in the air. On the ground, the takeoff airport altitude, actually cabin altitude, is fed into the pressurization controller at all times. On the ground and at lower power settings, the cabin is depressurized by driving the main outflow valve to the full open position. After a 1.5 second delay, when the throttles are advanced to achieve an N1 greater than 60% and an N2 greater than 89%, the controller modulates the main outflow valve toward closed, slightly pressurizing the cabin. This ground pressurization of the cabin makes the transition to pressurized flight more gradual for the passengers and crew, and also gives the system better response to ground effect pressure changes during takeoff. In the air, the pressure controller maintains a proportional pressure differential between airplane and cabin altitudes. By climbing the cabin altitude at a rate proportional to the airplane climb rate, cabin altitude change is held to the minimum rate required. Note: the controller senses only PSI. References to altitudes are approximations and vary according to density altitude. As the density of the air decreases, the greater the change in altitude is for a given PSI. An amber off-schedule descent light illuminates if the airplane begins to descend without having reached the planned cruise altitude. For example, a flight aborted in climb and is returning to the takeoff airport. The master caution lights and air conditioning annunciator light will also illuminate. After an off-schedule descent, the controller programs the cabin pressure to return to the takeoff field elevation without pilot input. However, if the flight altitude indicator is changed by the crew, the automatic capability to return the cabin to the takeoff field elevation will be lost. Normally, you will climb out and arrive at your cruise altitude. Approximately 1,000 feet below flight altitude, when outside air pressure is within 0.25 psi of the pressure that will exist when the airplane is at a selected flight altitude, the cruise mode is activated. The controller schedules a constant cabin altitude differential between flight and cabin altitudes during cruise as follows: at or below 28,000 feet, 7.45 psi differential; 28,000 feet to 37,000 feet, 7.8 psi differential; above 37,000 feet, 8.35 psi differential. During isobaric cruise, minor airplane excursions from flight altitude may cause the pressure differential to go as high as 8.45 psi differential to maintain a constant cabin altitude. During descent, the cabin pressure controller begins a proportional descent to an altitude slightly below the selected land altitude. The controller programs the cabin to land slightly pressurized so that rapid changes in altitude during approach result in minimum cabin pressure changes. After landing with N1 less than 50%, The controller drives the main outflow valve slowly to full open position, depressurizing the cabin. Having the main outflow valve full open also prevents the equipment cooling fan from depressurizing the airplane to a negative pressure. The alternate mode functions identical to the auto mode. It is engaged automatically upon failure of the auto mode or can be selected by the crew. An amber auto fail light illuminates if any of the following conditions occur: loss of DC power, controller fault, outflow valve control fault, excessive differential pressure greater than 8.75 psi, excessive rate of cabin pressure change, high cabin altitude, 15,800 feet. With illumination of the auto fail light, the pressure controller automatically transfers to the alternate mode. Moving the pressurization mode selector to the alternate position extinguishes the auto fail light, and the alternate light remains illuminated to indicate single-channel automatic operation. If the pressurization mode selector is in the manual position, a green manual light illuminates. Manual control allows the pilot to control the cabin altitude when the auto and alternate modes have failed. In the manual mode, the outflow valve switch is used to modulate the position of the main outflow valve. The pilot will determine the required cabin altitude by reference to the cabin flight altitude placard and will monitor the valve position by observation of the outflow valve position indicator. In manual, the main outflow valve is driven by a separate DC motor at a slower rate than the automatic modes. This module introduces